He was one of the most recognisable, unique, and influential world leaders of the entire 20th century. But on a warm spring day in 1981, Pope John Paul II came within a hair's breadth of a premature and shocking death. Whilst busy greeting a crowd of 20,000 worshippers in the Vatican, the sharp crack of bullets suddenly ripped through the air, and amidst the chaos, the Pope was hit twice. Although he fell unconscious and suffered heavy blood loss, he survived the shooting, and from that very moment began a mystery that has captivated the world ever since. For John Paul II was no ordinary pope. In fact, his papacy was one of the most consequential that history has ever seen. His extensive travels and the huge crowds he drew in grew the influence of the Catholic Church around the world. However, in some areas the authorities were far from comfortable with the Pope's influence and wished to get rid of him. One visit to his native Poland in particular would eventually change the face of Eastern Europe forever, but may also have placed the weapon in the assassin's hands. Today we look at the assassination attempt of Pope John Paul II, a remarkable story of survival, conspiracy, and forgiveness. Who was John Paul II, and why was his rule of the Catholic Church so historically significant? Born Karol Józef Wojtyła in Poland in 1920, as a young man the future Pope lived through the horrors of the Second World War. After escaping some mighty close calls with death during the Nazi occupation of his country in the 1940s, Wojtyła later saw Poland fall into the iron grip of the Soviet Union, with a communist government established after the war. Witnessing such extremes as a young man greatly influenced him, and he became a huge advocate for peace, human rights, and national freedom. After entering into the priesthood and steadily growing in influence within the church, in October 1978, Wojtyła was elected Pope by the College of Cardinals. He chose the name John Paul II as a tribute to his predecessor John Paul I, who had died just 33 days into his papacy. Elected at the relatively young age of 58, he became the first Polish Pope and first non-Italian Pope in over 450 years, instantly becoming a symbol of great pride amongst the struggling citizens of his communist-ruled homeland. Indeed, from his experiences as a young priest walking a tightrope against Poland's hardline government, communism had become perhaps his greatest foe. Among the many trips he made in his first 3 years as Pope, the most seismic of them all came in 1979 when he paid a visit to his home country. To the millions and millions of Polish citizens who turned out on the streets to see their hero, the Pope declared that their Catholic faith asserted that they have a right to be free. Seeing so many of their fellow citizens around them, and taking inspiration from the Pope's message, the people of Poland began to raise their voice against the communist authorities. The papal visit had lit the flame that illuminated their newfound collective strength, and a year later, Polish shipyard workers founded a trade union named Solidarity. This was the first trade union in the Eastern Bloc to oppose their government, attracting millions who peacefully demanded change. The government attempted to repress the movement, but it was simply too large, and the wheels of change in Warsaw were now slowly starting to turn. Whilst widely remembered, Poland was just one of many places he visited early on in his papacy, also travelling to the likes of Mexico, Ireland, and Turkey. He had a seemingly insatiable desire to meet with the peoples of the world, so much so that security was not at the forefront of his mind and was becoming ever more difficult to manage. The Pope-mobile was not as protective as it is today, and he had also once refused to wear a bulletproof vest, saying that danger was just an occupational hazard. But in the end, all of these trips and colossal gatherings passed with little trouble. It would instead be an otherwise normal day in the Vatican that would see the Pope suffer a frighteningly close brush with death. On May 13th, 1981, he was being driven across St. Peter's Square in an open-topped car, en route to his weekly general audience. Watched by a bustling crowd of 20,000 people, the atmosphere of excitement and devotion was suddenly cut open by the roar of gunfire. Shock quickly turned into horror as the crowd realised that the Pope had been hit. One bullet had struck his left index finger, but much more seriously, another had lodged in his abdomen. Bleeding heavily and appearing to be on the verge of death, John Paul II was rushed to hospital for a surgery that would ultimately save his life. Back in St. Peter's Square, the assailant was quickly apprehended by the shocked worshippers around him. He was identified as 23-year-old Mehmet Ali Arca, a Turkish hitman with a shady past and links to organised crime. Although he had been the gunman that very nearly ended the Pope's life, his image as a hitman led people to a question that would become one of the 20th century's great mysteries. Who was really behind the shooting? The question of who wanted Pope John Paul II dead that day has entranced and captivated investigators ever since Arca pulled the trigger. Who were the shadowy and powerful forces behind it? Theories, intelligence, and Arca's own contradictory and changing statements have all fed into the mystery. But let's start in the obvious place, by looking at the dark past of the assassin himself. Mehmet Ali Arca came from a vicious criminal underworld. In the late 1970s he joined an ultranationalist group called the Grey Wolves, and in 1979 murdered a left-wing journalist. He escaped from prison just a few months into his sentence, and sent a letter to the very same newspaper that the murdered journalist wrote for. The letter was written just a few days before the Pope was set to visit Turkey, and in it, Arca claimed that he would kill him if he ever entered the country. Often characterized as an Islamic fundamentalist and opponent of both American and Soviet imperialism, Arca derided the Pope as being a commander of the Crusades. All of this may point to personal motives for wanting to kill the Pope, but in terms of evidence to link the shooting to others in the Grey Wolves, the Italian investigators found nothing. But there was another part of the puzzle that became much more famous during the investigation: Arca's connections with the Bulgarian government. He spent time in the Bulgarian capital Sofia in 1980, and through his criminal connections met a Turkish businessman named Bekir Çelenk. Çelenk was said to have offered Arca a sum of over $1.2 million to kill the Pope on behalf of the Bulgarian government and security officials, although he later denied this. By Arca's own testimony, the plan was for he and another assassin named Oral Çelik to kill the Pope and then use the mass confusion of the crowd to make a dash for the Bulgarian embassy. When Arca was arrested, he was also found with phone numbers of several Bulgarian officials in his pocket, as well as a passport under a false name that had received a Bulgarian stamp. The Bulgarian connection threads through to one of the most prominent suspects of all, the Soviet Union. The theory goes that the Soviets saw the impact that the Pope was having on Poland, and it scared them to death. His role in stoking the fires of anti-communism and helping to inspire the creation of solidarity made him one of the very few people during the Cold War era to rattle the Soviet Union's iron grip on Eastern Europe. This rippling resistance is supposedly what spurred the Soviets to act, leveraging their Bulgarian allies to do the dirty work for them via Turkish intermediaries. In this theory, the trail would lead all the way back to Yuri Andropov, the head of the Soviet secret police, the KGB, and future leader of the Soviet Union. The idea of Soviet involvement was one of the most prominent theories at the time, both in the Italian investigations and throughout the Western world, remaining strong ever since. The fear that the Pope created within the Soviet leadership cannot be underestimated. Years later, when the first Western journalists were allowed into the KGB headquarters, some of its leaders claimed that to them, the Pope was the most dangerous enemy in the entire world. But despite this often recited narrative, the question of the KGB's responsibility remains hotly debated and has never been definitively proven. Arca's own statements throughout the years have also muddied the waters further. In the last 4 decades, he has variously pointed responsibility at himself, at the Soviets, at other figures in the Vatican, and even at the Iranian leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. This flurry of possibilities outlines the difficulty of pinning down those responsible for the shooting, and underpins why this mystery has persisted for so long. Ultimately, the plot had failed, but the shooting would not weaken the Pope's spirit, nor would it close the chapter between him and Arca. In fact, it would signal the start of a truly fascinating relationship. The shooting of the head of the Catholic Church naturally drew shock from around the world. Despite having stared death in the face, the Pope made a full recovery within just a few weeks. Security for him was tightened from that point onwards, leading to the Pope-mobile being fitted with the bulletproof glass that is so recognisable today. Although this assassination attempt had taken place less than 3 years into his rule as Pope, John Paul II would remarkably go on to lead the Catholic Church for over a quarter of a century, one of the longest papacies in history. The spark that had been ignited in his native Poland could not be extinguished by the communist authorities, even via brutal repression. Within a few years, this flame had ripped through the heart of communist Eastern Europe like wildfire. The Soviet Union had crushed threats to its authority before, but this time, faced with an increasingly stagnant economy and an unwinnable arms race against the West, they were powerless to stop it. A decade after the Pope's famous trip to Poland, the Soviet Union was done for, their grip on Eastern Europe quickly crumbling into dust. Many of these newly democratic countries that emerged managed to remove their communist governments peacefully, honouring the Pope's example. But what was most interesting of all in the months and years that followed was the relationship that developed between the Pope and the man who had tried to murder him. Just 2 years on from a day soaked in infamy, the Pope visited Arja in prison and publicly forgave him. He later met some of Arja's family, and in 2000 the would-be assassin was pardoned on the Pope's behalf, being released from his life sentence and sent back to Turkey. Once there, he was required to serve additional time for his crimes dating back to the late 1970s, and was eventually released in 2010. The Pope had been in good health even after the shooting, but as it began to decline years later, questions were asked of just how badly the bullets had affected him. On April 2, 2005, Pope John Paul II peacefully passed away just a few weeks shy of his 85th birthday. Arja had sent his well wishes during the Pope's final days, and in 2014 even visited his tomb, shortly after John Paul II had been canonised as a saint. The remarkable life of Pope John Paul II had come to an end in a calm and quiet manner, rather than in the midst of the carnage witnessed on St. Peter's Square 24 years earlier. Despite countless re-examinations and differing conclusions, the mystery of who exactly placed the gun in Mehmet Ali Arja's hand that day will likely remain one forever. The Pope's role in shaking the very foundations of Soviet power in Eastern Europe, through both his philosophy and personal background, is the reason that many still point fingers at the KGB to this day. But regardless of whether or not the Soviets were truly behind it all, a quote from the final Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev on the country's collapse really encapsulates the heart of this remarkable power struggle. It would have been impossible without the Pope. As always, we hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more from the Assassinations Archive.